So you have literally just ripped the receipt out of the till, said many thanks to the shopkeeper, slung your bike in the van and headed to the woods and done 1 to 2 hours ripping around the trails. However, you've had very little consideration for your bike setup. Now, setting up your e-bike is really, really important. So today we're going to talk about suspension, tyres, but first of all, that fit, the relationship between you and your e-bike. How do you get the perfect fit on your e-bike? After all, the weight distribution on an e-bike is quite different to that on a normal bike. What we're going to be discussing is actually the quite complex and sophisticated connection between your body and your bike, because it all has a huge impact on control, comfort, fatigue, and grip. So what we're talking hands, bum, and feet. Now, in terms of e-bike specifics, most of them tend to have a longer chainstay than normal bikes. And what that does is means there's more grip on the rear tyre. Added to that, a lot of the weight on a lot of e-bikes is up front because of where the battery is placed. And what this means is you don't have to be so concerned with keeping that front wheel on the deck. You can indeed run a higher bar on an e-bike. Okay, so what we're going to be examining is the relationship between the bar, the seat, and the pedals, because all combined have a huge impact on the dynamic ride of the bike. It doesn't matter whether it's climbing, descending, or ripping through single track, you will find that the millimeters do matter. So the first step of the big three figures is that between the crank and the handlebar. Why is it important? Well, because it has a huge impact on your weight distribution, which in turn leads to levels of fatigue and grip on the front tyre. Any shop will be able to help you in getting your sizing right. That is step number one. However, you can fine-tune that distance between changing such things as your handlebar, your stem, and the position of your stem in the steerer. Now, this is hugely personal, of course, different bodies, different shapes, different weights, but it's going to have a huge impact on your comfort and your control on your bike. Okay, so number 2 on our numbers hit list is the relationship between the handlebar and the seat. Now, obviously, if you're descending, this number is not really that important. However, for climbing and transferring, that's a key number. Now, chainstay will have an effect on this, but where you position your seat and your handlebar is going to have a huge impact on your weight distribution as you go up those hills. You can manage it by shifting the seat forwards in the rails, which has an effect of putting more weight further forwards, or you can raise the stem or the handlebar, which has an effect on shifting your torso backwards, which means there's more grip on the rear tyre. And why it's important is because that you can actually climb steeper, more technical terrain on an e-bike sat down. So you need to kind of manage exactly where you are on the bike. Number 3, the seat to crank measurement. So why is it important? Well, quite clearly, if you're descending, you really don't want that seat getting in the way. Luckily, we have seat droppers today, which means this number is infinitely adjustable. So obviously, as you're transferring through undulating single track, you're going to be altering that height for comfort, traction, and power. However, very importantly, is on an e-bike, you're going to have these super technical climbs. So managing that weight distribution rearwards or forwards, which affects the grip on the tyre, is really important. The seat dropper is more important on an e-bike than on any other bike. Now, many people think of suspension as a dark art, which it can be. It can take many years to really fine-tune your suspension. However, most mountain bike brands have a base setup on their website, so it really is the first port of call to get your suspension set up on your e-bike. If you're in the field, it's really simple. You're looking for 30% sag front and rear. Now, to do this, all you do is put the O-ring on the fork down to the seal, and you put the O-ring on the shock absorber up to the base of the shock there. You get on the bike. Don, can you give us a hand? So remember, you're looking at 30% here. So you just jump on the bike, and get into like a standing position. Okay, that's up there and that's down there, and then I get off. Okay, what have I got? I think the fork, probably kind of let a bit of air out of that. And on the shock absorber, I need to put a bit more air in the shock absorber. I mean, that's a very basic guideline, 30% front and rear sag. Don, how do you do it?
So with air suspension, it's actually really simple to change your air pressure in there, but you will need a shock pump. It's not very easy to do this with anything else. It is possible, but it's a bit of a bodge. To let air out, I've seen people just use their fingernail to push it in, but you're not going to get a very accurate measurement. So use your shock pump for putting air in and taking out. So again, if you need more sag, obviously take air out. If you need less sag, put more air in. On my fork, it's really helpful this. There's a sticker on the back of it that gives you a guide, as Steve's talked about really. You can find these on the websites, but this is on the fork. And it says for my weight, so about 70 kilos, it says 55 to 65 PSI. However, you need to add 10 PSI to that for an e-bike to account for that weight. So we're talking 65 to 75 PSI. Hopefully that's gonna get your sag about right. So things get slightly more complicated when you go to the back of my bike. So I've got a coil shock. So I don't have an air shock like Steve has. I don't have the advantage of being able to see the stroke and have that rubber ring for the amount of sag. But what you will find is that bikes come with different rated springs on there. So this is a medium-sized bike. That spring rate should there or thereabouts suit me. When you go to a large or an XL, they will get higher rated springs. However, if you're a really light rider or a really heavy rider, you may have to change the spring on that bike. You can wind some preload on using that cap, but you can't do too much of that. My best piece of advice here would be to actually talk to the manufacturer or the bike shop. They should be able to recommend you a spring weight for that bike and for your weight. Moving on to some pro suspension setup tips here. I think our 30% sag rule works really well for most people, but I think with some experience, you'll come up with your own preferred suspension setup. And actually, I like to run a slightly harder fork. So I actually aim for about 20 to 25% sag on my fork. However, on this bike here, I've got this RockShox Lyric up front, 180mm travel, and actually I find that after a day's riding, my O-ring sits about there, so I'm not using the whole travel. If I was using that full 180mm, it'd be sat up there. And actually what that tells me is that I've got the sag set correctly, but my fork is too progressive. It gets too hard at the end of its travel. So what I can do is take out some of those volume spacers in that fork, make that fork less progressive, make it more linear, and I'll probably find that fork works a little bit better for me.
Okay, the basics here are tyre pressure. Now, if you're a newcomer to mountain biking or you're light, you need to be looking at about kind of between 15 to 20 PSI. At least you can get away with that. As you become faster, you're going to need higher tyre pressures. Now, I'm 90 kilos and I run about 28 to 30. The Don, who's pretty fast and is 70 kilos, he runs about 28 to 30 as well. But there's a much bigger picture to talk about with tyres. I mean, the first thing is tread pattern. Now, on an e-bike, you're going to be climbing those super steep hills. So you make sure that you've got plenty of grip on the back tyre. Now, some e-bikes come with quite a slick back tyre. Now, if you live in a kind of dry, hot climate with smooth trails, that's going to be fine. However, if you're going to live in a kind of climate where there's a bit of wet, a bit of dry, a bit of kind of this and that, you should be looking at a different tyre type on the back, possibly. Some of this has got some bite in there. Okay, secondly, let's talk about the broad range of tyres. You've basically got wet tyres, dry tyres, and intermediate tyres. Now, you might want to explore this as your kind of riding experience kind of broadens. So it's definitely going to be a massive advantage if you're living in a wet climate to ride a wet tyre, because it's going to give you loads more confidence on the trail. Equally, if you live in a dry climate with loads of rocks, you don't want to be riding a wet weather tyre. So just some things to bear in mind there. Now, there's another part of tyres which comes into the picture as well, which is tyre compound. Now, I think that on an e-bike, you can actually get away with softer compound tyres, which means you've got more grip everywhere. The thing with soft compound tyres on non-e-bikes is that they're quite a drag, they're very heavy, they're about kind of between 1 to 1.5 kilos, so it puts a lot of people off kind of using them. But on an e-bike, it's not such a problem, and so it's definitely worth something to look into, is getting soft compound tyres, maybe kind of 2.5s on your e-bike in dry conditions. So thanks for watching. Like I said, if you want some more detail, we're more than happy to do this. If you want to see some e-bike tips from the Don, click here. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, and we'd love you to subscribe. Thanks, guys.